In February 2022, Western countries hit Russia with the most powerful set of economic sanctions in modern history, and one of the hardest blows landed directly on Russian aviation. Within months, hundreds of Boeing and Airbus jets operated by Russian airlines were effectively grounded, stripped of spare parts, technical support, and continued deliveries overnight. Aeroflot, Russia's biggest airline, began cannibalizing stored aircraft, pulling working parts off grounded jets just to keep other jets in the air. Russia needed a domestic aircraft fast, and the answer it turned to was a narrow-body jet that most of the aviation world had already forgotten existed. The Tupolev Tu-214 first flew in 1996, entered commercial service in 2001, and spent 2 full decades being produced at a rate of just 2 to 4 aircraft per year. Western aerospace analysts had largely dismissed it as a marginal holdover from the Soviet aircraft industry, a niche plane used by government agencies and a handful of charter operators. Then the sanctions hit, and Russia suddenly had 100 of them on order. In this video, we'll explain exactly what the Tu-214 is, why Russia is betting its entire commercial aviation future on it, and why the real numbers tell a very different story from the official announcements. The Tu-214 is a narrow-body twin-engine jet built at the Kazan Aviation Production Association in Tatarstan, a plant that has been producing aircraft for Russia since the Soviet era. It carries between 164 and 210 passengers, depending on cabin configuration, has a range of up to 9,300 kilometers in its extended range variants, and uses Aviadvigatel PS90 turbofan engines, producing roughly 16,000 to 18,000 kilograms of thrust each. The aircraft features a fly-by-wire control system, a glass cockpit, and a fuselage width comparable to the Boeing 757 and 767, making it genuinely competitive in passenger capacity with Western jets of its generation. But its generation is the key phrase. The Tu-214 was designed in the 1990s, and its engines, avionics, and systems reflect the technology of that decade. Before February 2022, Russia's commercial fleet was dominated by Boeing 737 and Airbus A320 family aircraft, which carried the overwhelming majority of passengers flown by Aeroflot, S7, and other Russian carriers every single day. When Western sanctions cut Russian airlines off from spare parts, maintenance support, and new deliveries, those airlines faced a brutal choice: cannibalize the fleet they already had, source parts through gray markets, or switch to Russian-built alternatives. The Russian government responded by redirecting significant budget resources into 3 domestic aircraft programs simultaneously: the Irkut MC-21, the Ilyushin Il-96-400, and the Tu-214. The Tu-214 received particular attention because it was the most immediately producible of the 3, with an existing factory, an existing supplier network, and decades of accumulated engineering documentation already in place. The crucial upgrade in the post-sanctions Tu-214 is what Russian industry calls full import substitution, replacing every Western-sourced component with a domestically produced Russian equivalent. Earlier production Tu-214 had incorporated Western avionics systems, Western braking units, Western auxiliary power units, and other imported subsystems that are now impossible to source legally. The updated version replaces all of these. Avionics are now Russian-produced. The auxiliary power unit is sourced from domestic suppliers, and the hydraulics, fuel system, and electrical system have all been re-engineered using Russian components. The PS90 engines that power the aircraft are produced entirely at the Aviadvigatel plant in Perm, with no dependence on any foreign supplier for continued production. The aircraft's airworthiness certification remains purely Russian, meaning it requires no interaction with the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, or the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, both of which have ended all cooperation with Russian aviation. In September 2024, the Russian airline S7 Group formalized an order for 100 Tu-214 aircraft, one of the largest single aircraft orders in Russian commercial aviation history. The announcement was made at the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok with significant government fanfare, and was framed publicly as a landmark commitment to Russian aviation self-sufficiency. Additional orders came from Rossiya Airlines, Russian government agencies, the Ministry of Defense, and the Foreign Intelligence Service, which operates a dedicated fleet for government transport. When all bookings are combined, the Tu-214 order backlog exceeds 120 aircraft, enough to keep the Kazan plant occupied for years if the production line can actually deliver them. Russia's production targets have been ambitious on paper. The official plan called for 4 aircraft delivered in 2025, rising to 7 in 2026, 17 in 2027, and approximately 28 per year by 2028. But Russia's aviation industry has a consistent pattern of announcing delivery targets that actual production numbers then fail to reach. And the Tu-214 has followed that pattern precisely. According to reporting by the Moscow Times in October 2025, the Kazan plant was on track to deliver only one Tu-214 during the entire calendar year of 2025, well below the official target of 4. This marked the 3rd consecutive year in which the Tu-214 program missed its announced production goals, a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Industry analysts have attributed the shortfall to 4 overlapping problems: supplier bottlenecks for key components, a shortage of trained skilled workers at Kazan and across the Russian aerospace supply chain, certification delays for the newly domesticated subsystems, and quality control issues that emerge when a production line tries to scale up rapidly from very low volumes. The economic challenge facing the Tu-214 goes beyond simply building the aircraft. It also has to compete operationally against the Western jets it is meant to replace. The PS-90 engines on the Tu-214 are approximately 15 to 20% less fuel efficient than the CFM56 engines on the Boeing 737 family, or the LEAP engines on the Airbus A320neo. On a single flight, that gap is manageable. But across an entire fleet flying hundreds of routes every day for years, that fuel efficiency difference translates into enormous additional operating costs that airlines must absorb. The newer Russian PD-14 engine program, designed for the MC-21 and potentially adaptable to other aircraft, is considerably more efficient, but it is not yet certified for the Tu-214 in production configuration. Beyond commercial aviation, the Tu-214 serves several other roles that keep the program strategically valuable to the Russian government, regardless of commercial sales performance. Maritime patrol variants are configured with extended surveillance equipment for monitoring Russian coastal waters and the approaches to Russian naval bases. The Tu-214R signals intelligence aircraft, fitted with specialized electronic collection equipment, has been reported in active operations over both Syria and Ukraine, gathering data on enemy communications and electronic emissions. Government VIP transport versions now carry Russian officials on long-range flights, following the grounding of the Western aircraft that previously served this role. The Tu-214 on variant was configured specifically for open skies treaty observation flights before Russia withdrew from the treaty in 2020, and several of those airframes continue serving in other reconnaissance roles today. Russia is not alone in facing this kind of forced aviation self-reliance. Iran has been navigating a nearly identical situation for more than 4 decades, since American sanctions cut Iranian airlines off from Western aircraft and spare parts. Iran's industry has survived through gray market parts sourcing, domestic reverse engineering, and Russian expertise. And Russian aviation planners have studied that model carefully as a reference point. The difference is that Russia has a considerably larger domestic engineering and manufacturing base than Iran, with a longer history of commercial aircraft production, meaning the sanctions are disrupting an existing capability rather than eliminating a non-existent one. Meanwhile, the Western manufacturers the Tu-214 is trying to replace have been facing their own serious production challenges through 2024 and 2025. Boeing experienced a critical safety incident in January 2024 when a door plug blew out of an Alaska Airlines 737 MAX-9 in flight, triggering regulatory scrutiny, a production slowdown, and a major workforce strike later that year. Airbus outperformed Boeing in single-aisle deliveries through 2024 and 2025, but both manufacturers have struggled to return production rates to the targets they had set before the pandemic disrupted global supply chains. Russia's claim that Tu-214 production could eventually rival Boeing's delivery numbers is misleading. Boeing delivered approximately 480 aircraft total across all models in 2022 alone, a figure the Tu-214 program could not approach even in its most optimistic projected scenario. The more realistic benchmark is historical Russian commercial aircraft production. In some years during the post-Soviet period, total Russian commercial aircraft output ran to just a few dozen aircraft annually. If the Tu-214 program reaches its stated goal of 28 aircraft per year by 2028, that would represent a genuine achievement by Russian aviation industry standards, even if it appears modest measured against Western production rates. What the Tu-214 story ultimately represents is Russia's attempt to rebuild an entire commercial aviation supply chain under extreme time pressure, cut off from the global manufacturing networks that every modern aircraft depends on. Every commercial jet flying today is assembled from components sourced from dozens of countries, engines from one place, avionics from another, landing gear from a third, specialty alloys from a fourth. Russia is attempting to recreate all of that supply chain domestically, simultaneously, across multiple aircraft programs at once. And the Tu-214 is the program where that attempt is most visible to the outside world. The real test of whether it will work is not the number of orders signed at press conferences. It is the number of jets that actually roll out of the Kazan factory, receive airworthiness certification, and enter scheduled airline service. Through the end of 2025, that number remains very small. Russian airlines under both economic and government pressure are committed to absorbing Tu-214 production as deliveries increase. But the trained pilots to fly them, the maintenance engineers to service them, and the spare parts supply chain to keep them in the air all have to be built from near zero at the same time. The Tu-214 is a real aircraft with a real production history and a real strategic role. But the gap between 120 aircraft on order and one aircraft delivered in 2025 tells you everything you need to know about how difficult this road actually is. Whether the program eventually reaches 28 jets per year or stalls indefinitely at a handful per year will depend on solving supply chain, workforce, and certification challenges that have blocked 3 consecutive years of missed targets so far. If you want to understand exactly how close or how far Russia is from genuine aviation self-sufficiency across all 3 domestic programs, the next video on this channel breaks down the full MC-21 and Il-96 stories alongside the Tu-214 picture.